Today, we are glad to introduce you to, anyone want to take a stab at how to pronounce her name? Radegund, yes. Great, it's a fabulous name. I tell my students that one of my goals is to have them name one of their children after some of the ladies that we do in this class. No one has yet. They have named pets, which I think is probably more appropriate. Yes, Radegund is one of the queens in our Queen, Saints, and Visionaries. She is a trauma survivor of war. She is a patron of many religious institutions, and she is also a poet. So we will have a wonderful opportunity to talk through her, but as is my teacher want, I want to see what we remember about the other ladies we've talked about in this class. So does anyone remember the names of either last week or the week before? Thecla, yes. And Perpetua and Felicitas, gold star to the couple in the back. Well done, yes. Our two sort of archetypal saints for the early church are Thecla and then Perpetua and Felicitas. Perpetua and Felicitas were in North Africa, and their story, purportedly, at least portions of, written by Perpetua herself as a prison narrative. Perpetua and Felicitas did meet their death in the arena, whereas Thecla, although she was in the arena twice, did not die, but miraculously survived and was able to continue her work without Paul's blessing. She is the Acts of Paul and Thecla is one of the things I would love to see in the canon, but it did not make it in the canon, mostly because it feels a little bit like a romance novel, where Thecla is just absolutely besotted with Paul and his message, and follows him around like a groupie was the way we described her last week, a groupie. But indeed, these two women sort of form our archetypal understandings of the church, especially the role of women in the church. What adjectives would you use to describe this kind of vision for the role of women in the church, given what we know about Thecla and Perpetua? What kind of adjectives would you use to describe them? Not interesting. Extraordinary. Okay, so pretty impressive. Okay. Agency, right? So both have a voice and leadership capabilities in the world of the early church, when many of us, when thinking about the 3rd century, would not assume that women had such roles. Both Thecla and Perpetua are leaders in their Christian communities, absolutely. And Thecla goes on a preaching, teaching tour herself, so it takes on more of a geographical range than Perpetua is able to. How else would we describe them? Threatening, oh my gosh, excellent, yes. Highly threatening. All of the women that we deal with in this class will be extraordinarily threatening. What's interesting about both Perpetua and Felicitas, as well as Thecla, is that these stories may represent larger groups of women engaging in these kinds of faith practices that were later declared heretical by the church. In particular, Perpetua has a lot of Montanist leanings. She is she experiences a number of visions, and the Montanists were known for ecstatic preaching and visions, and their two main leaders were women. Not a coincidence that about 50 years into that movement, they were declared heretical. No more. Thecla, similarly, has been named apocryphal. She's not in the Apocrypha, she's apocryphal. And Tertullian, our friend in North Africa who thought that Thecla was a little bit crazy for baptizing herself in a pool of seals in the arena. Those of you who missed that last week, you're now sad. You missed that, right? You didn't know rabbits. Lightning was involved in killing them. Very exciting. She is sort of part of a nascent community of women in Iconium, all of whom come together to protect her and then support her missions later on, even though Paul, our dear friend Paul, never authorizes her ministry. Yeah, because she's a woman, right. So dangerous, I think, is absolutely the way we would describe this. So these are the two sort of, when women look to the early church and when church fathers are talking about what's emblematic about women and virtues of women in this time period, these are the three ladies that they're mostly talking about. We are moving forward about 300 years to find Radegund, our queen. And in order to get there, I regret to tell you, I have to give you a little bit of history. I can't just move you 300 years without telling you a little bit about what happened. So, some history. Many of you may or may not know that in the latter portions of the Roman Empire, before it fell, they entered into a new type of governmental system called the tetrarchy. That's Greek for four, and this was Diocletian's brilliant idea in 293 that the empire was so big it could only be governed if they split it in half. And each half was ruled by two emperors. One was the senior emperor and one was the junior emperor. And in theory, this sounds remarkable, right? This sounds like a good idea. Perhaps things are going to go really, really well. And in fact, there's this beautiful porphyry statue of all the tetrarchs with their arms around each other like they're the best of buddies. How do you think four people ruling at a time went for Rome? Not well. You are correct. It did not go well at all because there wasn't really a plan for succession. When a senior emperor dies, does the junior emperor get promoted? Or if a junior emperor dies, does the senior emperor get to appoint the new person? Essentially, what resulted from the tetrarchy after Diocletian dies is a bunch of civil war. Civil war that happens separately in the eastern and western portions of the empire, which never come back together again, even after our buddy Constantine. So many of you have heard of Constantine, I'm sure. Why do you know who Constantine is? Not a trick question. He did, yes, the first Christian emperor of Rome. You may not have known that he emerged to the role of emperor through a series of civil war. And civil wars that occurred primarily for him, he was based in the east and others were in the west. He had a very important battle, the Battle of Milvian Bridge, in which he sees the symbol of the cross and the phrase, in hoc signes vinces, in this sign conquer. At which point, he decides that he is going to make Christianity an acceptable religion in the empire. It is not the official religion of the Roman Empire until Theodosius, a couple hundred years later, but it becomes an acceptable religion. And what's interesting about this religion becomes the glue that keeps the eastern portion of the empire together. Constantine, of course, very famously moves the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople. Excellently done. Yes, to Constantinople. And so, by 406, a couple hundred years after Constantine, we have a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, ooh, good gracious, we're going back to the Tetrarchs. The Eastern Roman Empire is significantly stronger than the Western Roman Empire. And in this map, I hope you can see a whole little pocket of, this whole little pocket of Germanic tribes that are all lurking around the borders of the Western Roman Empire. These Germanic tribes are being pushed forward by the Huns, right? Asiatic Huns moving across modern-day Russia and into Western Europe. And 406, check out this map. By the time we get to 476, what happened? Where's the Western Roman Empire? It fell, quote unquote. If I impress upon you anything about this period in history, the falling was not a moment. If you are asked on Jeopardy when Rome fell, the answer they're looking for is 476. When the Goths finally take over the last Western Roman emperor named Romulus Augustulus, Romulus being the first king of Rome and Augustus being the first emperor, so that was not a very auspicious name for him to have taken. 476 is what they're looking for, but the Goths had sacked Rome in 410. The infrastructure of the Western Roman Empire had been crumbling for the entire century. So yes, 476 is the moment where it falls, but this had been building for quite some time. The reason for that is, what infrastructure, when I say Roman infrastructure, what do you think I'm talking about? Okay, so churches, yes, will come into that power gap, but the political engine of the Roman Empire is its military. And what's really interesting about the military is when they are not fighting, which is the majority of the time, they are actually making things run. They're building roads, they're delivering mail, they're repairing fences, they are creating the paths, quite literally, within which communication happens in the Western Roman Empire. The garrisons are posted in significant portions of the Western Roman Empire, right? So they're all over here. But as resources and finances start to be shifted to the east, there's less and less funds to support the military in the west. And if you don't pay your soldiers, what happens? They go somewhere else. Exactly. Interesting point of fact, many of these Germanic tribes had been brought into the Western Roman Empire as mercenaries. So the problem is a long-standing problem, and part of correcting it for the Romans was inviting these Germanic tribes in to be farmers, to be soldiers, to supplement the crumbling infrastructure of the Western Roman Empire. So when we see this giant shift from 406 to 476, this is not a moment. This is a long-standing slide into these Germanic tribes being more Roman than the Romans themselves. Okay? So they, as a part of the sort of contract, when they came into the Western Roman Empire, some of them actually gained citizenship. They admired Roman laws. They admired Roman customs. So when we talk about this time period, this is generally called sort of a barbarian era. We understand that barbarian is a very negative term, yes. And this is also called the Dark Ages. I do not like this term. Why do you think I don't like this term? There's a ton of stuff happening, and just because it's not recorded or archived in a significant way doesn't mean stuff isn't happening here. And my favorite quote from a Merovingian scholar named Linda Kuhn is, "If it was dark, it was the darkness of the womb." Yes, so it was gestating, right, this new way of being in Western Europe that still had huge flavors of Rome in it, but it also had a number of really interesting things. We're gonna go backwards, okay, right? So the movements of the Germanic peoples were some of the things that facilitated this collapsing of the Western Roman infrastructure. This is because Rome always wants to be enormous. Empire's gonna empire, is what I say to the students in my class. And the bigger you get, the more difficult it is to maintain those borders, right? The other key facet for why the Western Roman Empire was more vulnerable to a collapse than the East is because the Eastern Empire was mercantile. Their whole system was based on buying and selling and the moving of goods, not the creating of the goods themselves. The Western Roman Empire is exceedingly agrarian. So when you lose the ability to protect your fields and can no longer harvest and can therefore no longer sell what you are growing, that sort of gradually causes this disintegration. So the Western Roman Empire was rife for a fall long before 476. And it's interesting, one of the tribes that takes over most of Western Europe as we know it are the Franks. What countries do the Franks occupy? What modern countries? France and Germany, yep. So the name France comes from the Franks, which are a group of Germanic tribes that end up in modern day France. And I hope you can see these greens are not, they're kind of hard to differentiate between. But Frankish territory in 481, the darker the color, the longer that region has been held by the Franks. And what's important about the Franks is that they are converted to Christianity, and they are not converted to Arian Christianity. They are converted to Catholic Christianity. Arian Christianity is what most of the Germanic tribes were at this time, and they are converted serendipitously due to the baptism of one of the earliest Frankish kings named Clovis. So Clovis is married to Clotilda. She's the lady that's lurking over here in the corner. And she is a Burgundian princess, and a local bishop had arranged the marriage of Clotilda to Clovis, hoping that that would convert Clovis. Early on in their marriage, they have a child, and Clovis is convinced by his wife to baptize the child, but the child dies. And Clovis says, this is a really terrible sign, not going to be a Christian. However, in a later battle, Clovis is losing, and he prays to Jesus, and wins the battle and sees that as a sign by which he should convert to Christianity. Does that remind you of anyone else? Constantine. We love a battlefield conversion. Yes. And Gregory of Tours, who is the one who writes this history, is very explicit in making that connection, that Clovis is the new Constantine. In the 6th century, when a leader converts, essentially everyone in their country is also converted by magic. This is not a personal religion. This is not people taking Christ in their heart and getting baptized themselves. No, this is a one-time thing. Everybody in Francia is now Christian. And they are Catholic Christian, thanks, of course, to Clotilda.
Will you tell us where these works are?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So this is a gospel cover, an ivory gospel book cover, and this is an illuminated manuscript from the 13th century, both of Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, which sounds boring, but it's basically like the People magazine version of history. So scandalous. I love it so much. It's amazing. And the Merovingians, the reason for this is Clovis and all of the people that lead in his era are called Merovingians, from Merovech, who's their progenitor that may not have actually lived. But they are so messy. They are so messy. They're just all drama, no leadership. It's amazing. I highly recommend, if you're going to read any portion of this history, read the History of the Franks. So the interesting thing about this time period is that they start to collect kind of a cultural collective identity around Christianity. So Christianity starts to be, again, very effective glue for keeping these nation states, these nascent nation states in order. In order for them to function as sort of entities, political entities, they have to make use of Roman infrastructure. They have to make use of Roman roads. They have to make use of Roman judges and Roman legal systems in their area. But they can't really control anywhere close to the scale of the Roman Empire's geography. These little circles, squarish looking things, are about as big as any single Merovingian king can hold. That means their military might is limited to one of these circles. And what's interesting, too, about this is in order to get larger, in order to take over multiple of these little regions, they rely on relationships with bishops of the church. So in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, in the loss of the political infrastructure in the West, bishops and church leaders start to become de facto political entities. No one is here to help us figure out what's going on. I'm a bishop. I'm a Roman, I'm probably an elite Roman, and I am equipped to do some leading at this time period. So these Germanic Christian kings become Christian, both because they had a revelation on the battlefield, but also because the Christian bishops are the real power in the region. So when Clovis marries Clotilda, it's as a favor to the local bishop. And it's also, I hope you can see, Austrasia is where Clovis is from, and Burgundy is down here. So that was both a religious connection and a marriage connection that allowed for the expansion of Clovis's empire. So the Merovingians are, of course, only become the Merovingians due to their relationship with local bishops. So this is a map of the Christian churches before the persecution of Diocletian. Diocletian, who began our tetrarchy visual. So most of these are in North Africa and Asia Minor, some in Italy, right? By the time we reach the Merovingian era, we have, by the 8th century, all of these are ecclesial structures just in modern-day France. So we have an explosion of church infrastructure in the power vacuum of the Western Roman Empire's infrastructure. So in order to move forward, in order to have any power in this region, you had to work with the local bishops. And it is into this era of Merovingian life that we see our friend Radegund. So I want to return to this map. We've got the Eastern Roman Empire flourishing over here, and we've got a whole bunch of a whole bunch of Germanic tribes here. And this is in 476. Keep an eye on what's happening in Western Europe. Whoop. Yep. The Franks took over all of that region by virtue of strategic marriages and strategic alliances with the bishops in the region. And you also see the Eastern Roman Empire decided that it was going to go take over everything that used to be Rome. That's Justinian, and it lasts for like 20 years. It was not a good plan. Keep it local, is my thought. So, the Frankish kingdoms here are where our story begins today, with Radegund, who is the wife of, there we go, the wife of Clothar, and the Merovingian kings. This map, this genealogy, shows you just how messy things were. One of the things that contributed to the messiness was you could have multiple wives. So that means multiple children. The other thing that contributes to the messiness is they don't have primogeniture. What is primogeniture? Where the firstborn child gets everything. So essentially, we have multiple children with multiple wives, basically fighting amongst themselves to claim the region. That does not make for a lot of sustainable leadership in the Merovingian period. It is messy. And Radegund marries into the second generation of the Merovingian dynasty. So Clovis is Radegund's grandfather. And Radegund is from Thuringia, which is right here on the border. It's more in modern-day Germany than modern-day France. And she is taken as a prisoner of war by Clothar when she is aged 11. As an 11-year-old, her entire family, minus one uncle, is murdered because you can't leave leaders of an opposing kingdom alive to make a claim to the throne later on. The whole point of this is to take one princess, marry her to Clothar, and by that, and kill everyone else, so Clothar now has a claim to Thuringia, her kingdom. She is allowed to grow up for a little bit, where she's trained, and we'll see some stories of her as a young child, along with other elites in the region. And she then is married to Clothar and serves as a queen for quite some time. During that time, she claims she does not have any relations with her husband. And the fact that she doesn't have any children leads me to believe that was true. Sometime during their marriage, she decides that this is not working for her, and so she goes and leaves Clothar and becomes a deaconess at a local monastery. Peace. See you later, Clothar. Clothar is okay with it a little bit, okay enough that at a couple years after this, he gives her the land to found her own monastic community at Poitiers. So she's now the leader of her own monastic house. And she leads this monastic house for almost 30 years until she dies at 65. This is a really interesting life story. And the fact that she was a princess and a queen tells you she had access to a great deal of power, but it is all coded in the ways that female leadership is coded in this time period. And both of her biographers, and we have two different biographers, which is really interesting, meld these visions for her life. We have two versions of her biography, one of which is written by her confidant and local bishop, Venantius Fortunatus. Great name, right? That's why you come, just to get the cool names. Venantius Fortunatus, who is her confessor, which means he's the one who heard her confessions. He writes about 10 years after Radegund has died, and he is a local bishop. So his version of her story is invested in her queenly roles and in her advocacy while she is the leader of a monastic community. The second version of her story is actually written by a fellow nun named Bonanivia, who is actually depicted here in a 13th century manuscript with a stylus and a wax tablet doing the writing. And she writes about 20 years after Radegund's death, and it's clearly meant as an addendum to Venantius's version. She says very often, "Oh, woe is me, I am a woman writer, I could not possibly reach the heights of Venantius, but I am here because I feel called." And all of these protestations of humility are everywhere in women's writings from this time period. So we have two versions of her vita, her life, which is really interesting. for a woman of this time period and for one of them to be written by women, which is great. So we now have Perpetua, who writes her own story, and Bonanivia, who writes the story of her queen/nun, Radegund. So if anyone ever tells you women were not writing in these time periods, you now have plenty of ammo to tell them they are wrong. What's interesting about each of these stories is that they foreground different visions of who Radegund was. On the one hand, she was a queen. While she is a queen, she intercedes on behalf of slaves and political prisoners. She executes economic patronage by endowing different church buildings, by providing some of her jewels and her clothing to specific churches. She also has this special place in her heart for slaves and frees many of them during her time as queen. But she's also later on a nun. And what's interesting about that is that it takes on a similarly domestic kind of role that you would see as a queen overseeing the royal household. And as we saw with Thecla and Perpetua, the household and the domus is a space of real authority in the Greco-Roman world, and that is also true in the Merovingian period. So when we see her doing things like hosting banquets or inviting local church leaders to her monastery, these are acts of patronage and political authority. They're not just Susie Homemaker having folks at her dinner table to show them she can make pies. This is an act of authority, right? And it's the monastic houses that are responsible for reminding people and celebrating the local lineage of kings. The liturgies around death and dying are done in monastic houses, and it is they who carry the memory of the royal household. So in many ways, she is the royal household for the first half of her life, and then is responsible for cherishing and holding on to the memory of that royal household when she becomes a nun. She also has some really amazing relic acquisition stories. So we talked about relics. Who remembers what relics are? I'm doing this. I don't really know why. What are relics? Often a piece of a saint's body, sometimes a contact relic, something that the saint came into contact with, sometimes a piece of the true cross. And one of the ways women in particular executed authoritative visions for the world was by acquiring relics, right? This is okay for women to do because it's still a religious thing. It's not political, technically speaking. And yet having it, when you have a relic, remember, that's economic authority. People come and visit you, right? They want to see your relic. They pay you to see your relic. So relic acquisition is one way that women in particular executed some political authority in this time period. So what's also interesting about Radegund is I would describe her, if I had one word to describe her, I would describe her as intense. She's very intense. And she takes on, when she becomes the abbess of this community at Poitiers, the rule of a Roman named Caesarius. Caesarius is one of the folks in the early West that figured out they needed to have rules, regula, rules for monastic communities. Remember, monasticism has its origin in Africa, in Egypt, and in Asia Minor, and it gradually, monasticism as a lifestyle makes its way to the West through people like Caesarius. Caesarius had a sister named Caesaria, whom Radegund asks for a female version of the rule that Caesarius wrote. And as part of this letter back and forth from Caesarea to Radegund, Caesarea is like, just take it down a couple notches when you do this monastic life, okay? You're a little intense. So she says, as attentively as secular men hear when royal precepts are read, so attentively listen when divine readings are read. Let the whole mind, the whole thought, the whole meditation be on the precepts of the Lord. Solicitously fear that cursed are those who fall away from your commandments. And who would not keep one or the least of the Lord's mandates will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Fulfill this. May meditation of the heart always be in your sight. Hide your words in my heart that I may never sin against you. Let none of those entering not learn letters. So that means every woman entering this monastic house is educated. Let all hold the Psalter in memory, and as I have said, be zealous to carry out all the things which you read in the gospel. I did what you ordered. I sent a copy of the rule which the Lord Pope Caesarius of blessed and holy memory sent us. See how you keep it. "It comes to me that you abstain too much. Do everything reasonably if you would live for me and always be able to." So one of the pieces that we saw in the Thecla and Perpetua narratives is that the peak of Christian devotion is martyrdom. When martyrdom is no longer the ultimate or even a possible avenue for Christians in the 6th century, how do you prove your loyalty to God? Radigan takes some physical mortifications pretty far down the road. And we'll see those in a second. But Caesarius heard this and tries to tell her to be reasonable. Later on, you'll tell me if you think she actually was reasonable. The answer is no, she was not. But Radigan is also negotiating, as she becomes a nun, her relationship to her former husband. At one point, even after he's endowed Radigan with the space for the monastery at Poitiers, he decides maybe he's going to go get her back. This is not a good look for him. His wife has decided to go be a nun. She's also gathering a lot more authority than he thought she would when he put her in a monastery. And so he actually thinks about sending a messenger to her. And he sends a messenger to her and says, "I think you should come back." And the messenger returns to Clothar weeping, prostrating himself at the king's feet before the tomb of St. Martin, and solemnly entreats Clothar in God's name not to go to the city of Poitiers. "King of the region, don't go to Poitiers, where your wife is." Understanding that the petition came from his blessed queen, the king was full of sorrow. Led to repentance, he repudiated his evil counselors. So apparently, it's his political counselors that are like, "This is a really bad look for you. You should probably get her back." And so he has to repudiate these evil counselors, and judging himself unworthy to have such a queen any longer, he, Clothar himself, prostrates himself before St. Martin's threshold at the feet of Apostolic Germanus, praying him to ask Blessed Radigan's forgiveness, asking Radigan for her forgiveness for even thinking about bringing her back, for obeying his evil counselors and sinning against her. As a result, the same divine punishment soon struck those who acted against the Blessed Queen as struck Arius, who, opposing the Catholic faith, lost all his bowels in a flux from his belly. So there's so many layers here. First of all, Clothar doesn't actually go there. Clothar sends a messenger. Messenger comes back and is like, "Don't come." At which point Clothar realizes he made a boo-boo, and Radigan is actually more authoritative than he thought. So he goes to the local bishop, Germanus, and apologizes for sinning against Radigan. And then all the evil counselors lose their bowels. Which, by the way, Arius is that the arch heretic. Arian Christianity is the bad kind of Christianity. So this is really bad. So this is a lot of authority this woman has. And you can see this, too, in a number of different ways as we move through her vita. So I'm going to show you a couple different manuscripts that have illuminated her vitae, which are really fun, and they're kind of dark, so we'll have to work hard to see them. But this scene at the very beginning on both slides, this is obviously a much later illuminated manuscript. This one is actually from the 10th century, so it's only a little bit after Radigan lived herself, and you can see her name, Radigan, up here. Do anybody have an idea about what scene this is? She is absolutely trying to tell them no. This is Clothar taking her as an 11-year-old. And these are her family members trying to keep her there. And this is Clothar saying, "I don't care." So what was Radigan's early life before she was actually married to Clothar? When she was a child, having lost her entire family, this is what her life was like, apparently. Like the Israelites. She departed and migrated from her homeland. It wasn't like she didn't depart of her own will, to be clear, but the royal girl became part of the plunder of these conquerors, and they began to quarrel over their captive. If the contest had not ended with an agreement for her disposition, the kings would have taken up arms against one another. So again, Clothar with his many brothers took Thuringia together, and then they're sort of trying to figure out who gets what from the place that they conquered, including an 11-year-old. The maiden was taught letters and other things suitable to her sex. Wonder what those things are. And she would often converse with other children there about her desire to be a martyr if the chance came in her time. It's an 11-year-old. Told you she was intense. Thus, even as an adolescent, she displayed the merits of a mature person. While but a small child, she herself brought the scraps left at the table to gather children, washing the head of each one, seating them on little chairs, and offering water for their hands, and she mingled with the infants herself. She would also carry out what she had planned beforehand with Samuel, who's acting like a little cleric, another kid hanging out with her, following his lead, carrying a wooden cross they had made, singing psalms. The children would troop into the oratory as somber as adults. Radigan herself would polish the pavement with her dress, and collecting the drifting dust around the altar in a napkin, reverently placed it outside the door rather than sweep it away. How many 11-year-olds do you know that act like this? So what are we seeing? What are the biographers trying to lift up as characteristics of 11-year-old Radigan? Say it again. Faithfulness, like deep faithfulness in everything she does. Deep selflessness, giving all the scraps to the other children, doing the little church ceremony herself, carrying the cross, right? Leadership. She's the one leading all the kids. Doesn't surprise me. She was probably a bossy child, which I was too. So again, this is a common trope in hagiographic literature to have scenes from their childhood sort of prefigure the deeds they will take on as adults. So she's already taking care of other people, ministering to others, executing domestic tasks, taking the dust from the church, but not just sweeping it away, because that would not be good. So that's first at Radigan. There we go. What do you think's happening here? So this is actually Clothar. So this is her hosting, and it's a little easier to see on the more modern one over here. This is her hosting banquets as queen. She's hosting banquets as queen, but in this other panel, what is she doing? She's praying. So every scene of her queenly duties is contrasted with her being more intense in her religious duties. This is my favorite part of the story. So according to her biographers, in order to maintain her chastity, she would leave the bed at night and prostrate herself on the ground. And this is how she got away with it. So at royal banquets, right, she most deliciously ate on beans or lentils, rather than all of the really good food, in the manner of the 3 boys. Which 3 boys? It's biblical. They went into a fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Come on, guys, you haven't seen that VeggieTales? Oh, a very formative part of my childhood. So the idea is she's having very austere relationships with food. At a banquet, this royal banquet, she's eating beans, okay? So then at night, when she lay with her prince, she would ask leave to rise and leave the chamber to relieve nature. This is her story. I have to go to the bathroom. But then, instead of going to the bathroom, she would prostrate herself in prayer under a hair cloak by the privy so long that the cold pierced her through and through, and only her spirit was warm. Her whole flesh prematurely dead, indifferent to her body's torment, she kept her mind intent on paradise and counted her suffering trivial, if only she might avoid becoming cheap in Christ's eyes. Okay, so what's a hair shirt? Yeah, so it's like an animal skin, but instead of having the hair stuff on the outside, it's on the inside. So you've ever gotten a dog hair like stuck in your clothes, like a single dog hair? It's just my dog. Yes, it's an act of penitence. So she's not only wearing the hair shirt, she's also prostrating herself on the ground so long, it's like she's dead. Told you, intense. And in fact, her biographers say she's more monarcha than monarcha. Monarcha is a nun, and monarcha is a queen. So that's a Latin pun. That's 1-letter difference. She also, while she was a queen, she was not separated from her celestial husband, Jesus, right? She was not separated from the celestial one, and the more secular power was bestowed on her, the more humbly she bent her will, more than befitted her royal status. So she gives to the poor, she gives a number of different objects, candles, cloaks, jewels, she cares for the sick, she intercedes, speaking on behalf of political prisoners, and she fasts and takes on prayer practices. All the time, her entire life. When she eventually becomes so this is where she's from, Thuringia, over here. She spends a lot of her life in Tours, but then Poitiers, down here in modern-day France, is where her monastic house is founded. And at Poitiers, everything, her life kind of gets down to these 4 or 5 areas. This is a wonderful description of some of her care for the ill. Doesn't this make one shudder, the things she did so sweetly? When leopards arrived and sounded a warning, came forward, she directed her assistant to inquire with pious concern whence they came and how many there were. Having learned this, she had a table laid with dishes, spoons, knives, cups, and goblets, and wine, and she went in secret herself so that none might see her. Seizing some of the leprous women in her embrace, her heart full of love, she kissed their faces. This is people with leprosy. Then, while they were seated at table, she washed their faces and hands with warm water and treated their sores with fresh unguents and fed each one. When they were leaving, she offered small gifts of gold and clothing. To this, there was scarcely a single witness, and this is while she was still queen. But the attendant presumed to chide her softly, "Most holy lady, when you have embraced lepers, who is going to kiss you?" Pleasantly, she answered, "Really, if you won't kiss me, it's no concern of mine." That's, I feel like, a snap moment, and so she keeps up this same care for the ill, for the least of these, domestic tasks that are really beneath her when she's a nun in her community. So while all of her fellow nuns are asleep, she collects their shoes, restoring them cleaned and oiled to each, leaves them outside their door. On other quadragesmas, she was more relaxed, eating on Thursday and again on Sunday. So that's a fasting practice that is relaxed, where she eats only on Thursday and Sundays. The rest of the time, when health permitted, except for Easter, she led an austere life in sackcloth and ashes, rising early to be singing psalms while others awoke. For no monasterial offices pleased her unless she observed them first. She punished herself if anyone did a good deed before she did. When it was her turn to sweep the pavements around the monastery, she scoured the nooks and crannies, bundling away whatever nasty things were there. I don't know think about what that was. Never too disgusted to carry off what others shuddered to look upon. She did not shrink from cleaning the privies, but cleaned and carried off the stinking dung. For she believed she would be diminished if these vile services did not ennoble her. She carried firewood, she blew on the hearth, she would care for the infirm beyond her assigned week, cooked their food, washed their faces, bring them warm water, and went on the rounds for those she was caring for, and returned fasting to her cell. It's a lot. Yes?
Were any of her biographers prone to exaggeration?
It's possible. It's absolutely possible, and that's a part of hagiography as well, to make them, if they're one thing, they're the most of that thing. However, because we have the letter from Caesarea already saying you need to take it down a notch, my thought is she was actually pretty intense. Maybe not this intense, but pretty intense. And I'm going to spare you from the actual descriptions, but she went under a number of physical mortifications. She would tie chains around her arms and left them there when the skin grew on top of them. She put a brass plate, which was in the shape of Jesus. She burned herself with it and wore hair cloths on top of all of this. And again, the thought process is this: so that she might be a martyr, though it was not an age of persecution. We're all uncomfortable. Yes?
Was the monastery then the same as it is now?
In what sense?
It is something.
It is. So absolutely, the monastic life is ascetic to begin with. Absolutely. There are boundaries on what you eat, what you read, when you do things. It's a highly structured way of life that's designed to take your mind up to heaven instead of thinking about your physical self. This is more extreme than any monastic community.
Monastery in Poitiers.
Yes? Oh, it's absolutely still there. Oh, I know. You should go if you haven't been. Go check it out.
I'm
Yes, it is. It absolutely is. And I think I have a picture of it in a minute. Pardon? It's huge, absolutely. Building campaigns were her thing. In addition to the physical mortifications, she was also well known for performing miracles. And it's worth asking, to what extent were these miraculous things possible because of the depth of her faith, as exemplified in these alarming practices? So she exorcises a nun who has a demon inside of her. She cures another demon, a woman that has blindness. And this is Bonanivia's story. This is her very, oh, woe is me, humble, please don't look at me, I'm just a woman, writing about Bonanivia. I'm not going to read that because we just have a couple seconds left. But basically, even though in unworthy language, I pray you will aid me with your prayers because I am more devoted than learned. We know everybody in that monastery was smart as hell. This is not. It's just being themselves. Okay, so the relic transmission is the piece that I think is really, really interesting to end with. So she's gifted a piece of the true cross, as well as a finger of Mamas, who is a saint from Asia Minor. What's cool about the true cross is that this was a thing that Constantine's mother, Helena, was really known for. So we're starting to see, again, this across different hagiographic trends, certain mile markers of really significant women starting to do similar things. And you can see here, this is where the nuns bring back the stuff for her, and this one looks a lot cooler. Obviously, they're dressed as modern as in 16th century nuns here, which I think is really delightful. And this is the description of that. What Helena did in Oriental lands, Radigan the Blessed did in Gaul. Since she wished to do nothing without counsel, she sent letters to the local king, who held this land in his power, asking that for the welfare of the whole fatherland, he would permit her to ask the emperor in the east for wood from the Lord's cross. He consented, and she, who had made herself a pauper for God, full of devotion and inflamed with desire, sent no gifts to the emperor. She didn't need to buy this relic. Instead, she sends her messengers bearing nothing but prayers and the support of the saints whom she invoked incessantly. She got what she prayed for, that she might glory in having the blessed wood of Lord's cross enshrined in gold and gems, and many of the relics of the saints that had been kept in the East living in that one place. At the saint's petition, the emperor sent legates with gospels ornamenting in gold and gems, and the wood where once hung the salvation of the world came with a congregation of saints to the city of Poitiers. And this is where it is. Yes?
In many of these pictures, they have representation of her in royal garb.
Yes, absolutely.
And that seems to contrast with what is...
Absolutely. So these are the royal legates coming to the monastic house, and you can see all of the women who have their hair covered. These are all nuns as well, and these are the legates bringing. But what's interesting about Radigan is she is always depicted inside this building. So she is cloistered, even though no one else is, right? Even though she's doing her cures, she's popping out of the window to do it, right? And the finger bone of Mamas, they know that this finger bone of Mamas is meant for her because when one of the legates touches the finger, it breaks off with no problems. It was destined for her.
Is she sainted?
She is not sainted. So the contemporary Catholic Church introduced a great deal of infrastructure to investigate certain folks for being sainted or not. And so she is not technically sainted. However, she is pretty badass, if you ask me. So now that we've all decided, intense is one word we would use to describe her. How else would we describe her? Very powerful, both as a queen and as a nun.
I think the word visionary, I mean, she seems to really get the idea of helping.
Charity is at the core of who she is. Yep. Very extreme. Would not recommend you do any of that stuff. For the very.
That's not a jar.
No, agreed, but it's true. I mean,
But, but also she had to be a hell of an administrator. I mean,
she was absolutely. She got stuff done. Yep.
characteristic, but
And I want to throw out there, too, to what extent is the extreme of her religious practice perhaps a response to the trauma she experienced as an 11-year-old? Right? As a prisoner of war? I mean, makes sense. Yes, ma'am.
Was she still considered a
That's a great question. So obviously Clothar still considers her a queen, but she did not want that title. And the funny thing is, she's not even the abbess of the monastery. Can you imagine being the abbess at Radigan's monastery? That would be such a nightmare. I would not want her to be looking over my every shoulder. In fact, one of the miracles that happens after her death is that one of the nuns sits in Radigan's chair and she's like struck by lightning. Like, don't sit in Radigan's chair. But she is amazing. And again, when we think about this time period, the Dark Ages, we think of, well, if we think of anything at all, we think of lots of battle and lots of male leadership. Lots of women doing the same. Awesome. Well, thanks y'all for being here. Next week, we're going to be doing Bridget. So we're going to pop over to Ireland for a little bit of fun there before we keep going with more Germanic stuff. So thank y'all so much.